The day Mount Ararat opened, the mountain did not so much groan as reveal, a fissure in the blue ice, a seam of black rock, and beneath it a hollow that no map had marked. For hours the team watched steam spill from the crack, watched lenses fog and fingers tremble, until finally a shape, part metal lattice, part timber, part textile, glinted in a shaft of late sunlight. It was small enough to be carried by a handful of men, and strange enough to unsettle assumptions that archaeologists had been repeating for generations. This was not the rough handiwork of a passing nomad. The joinery hummed with precision. The metalwork bore hammer marks that implied controlled deformation rather than crude casting, and the fabric had a dye whose chemical signature spoke of a rare marine mollusk, thousands of miles and many social worlds away. Why would such an object be buried inside Ararat's ice? How could the combination of materials, worked acacia, beaten metal of an unfamiliar alloy, trampled textiles, fit into anything we thought we knew about ancient mobile sanctuaries? And, most provocatively, if the workmanship and materials corresponded to descriptions preserved in Exodus, what did that mean for the way we read text and stone together? From the moment the camera lights blinked on and the first notes of field logs were recorded, discussion split into careful categories. Some specialists scanned the object with handheld spectrometers and called the initial results suggestive before anyone used a stronger word. Others, looking at the grain of the wood and the curl of hammered metal, felt the hair rise on the back of their necks. Had they stumbled across an artifact that required historians to rethink what nomadic craftsmanship could achieve? These were dramatic questions, and they deserved both an investigative spirit and disciplined restraint. If you love archaeological mysteries, hit subscribe. This one will take us from the ice of Ararat to the heat of desert forges, and to a tent that the Bible describes in language that has always sat awkwardly next to our ideas about nomads and material culture. To understand why an object pulling together these materials would be so provocative, we have to step back and rethink a central image of the biblical wilderness, the tabernacle. When modern readers hear the word tent, they imagine poles and canvas, perhaps a simple shelter erected for months at a time. The text of Exodus gives us more than that, and the more we attend to the materials and instructions recorded there, the less plausible a casual, makeshift image becomes. What the narrative records is a sanctuary whose parts were specified with exact measurements, whose metals were beaten and polished, whose textiles carried dyes and embroidery of extraordinary labor, and whose assembly and disassembly had to be achieved without compromising sacred geometry or ritual integrity. Enter Bezalel and Oholiab.
The text introduces them not simply as craftsmen, but as divinely gifted master artisans, selected and filled with skill, knowledge of metalworking, weaving, carving, capacities framed as gifts from God. That theological point is not a quaint aside. It functions like an artistic credit line and a social explanation at once. Imagine Bezalel teaching a cohort that had recently been slaves in Egypt how to read a metal's temper by sound, how to coax a seam of gold to stretch without cracking, how to set a gemstone so that it would face the sun in a precise orientation. Imagine the social transformation required. People who had known only forced labor were now entrusted with the most sacred tasks of their community, elevated into skilled positions that carried responsibility and theological weight. The materials themselves, acacia wood for structure, beaten gold for ornament, silver for bases, linen and wool dyed in exotic colors, tell a story of practical ingenuity. Acacia, a thorny and hard wood, resists rot and holds joinery well. In a portable shelter, it is an ideal choice when properly seasoned and used in modular fashion. Gold, with a melting point at roughly 1064 degrees Celsius, cannot be casually melted in a low-temperature fire. To beat a menorah or ornament from a single sheet of gold requires not only knowledge of hammering and annealing cycles, but a controlled environment and abundant fuel. Silver bases used as modular footings solve a problem that few modern interpreters have paused to visualize. How do you keep heavy timber furniture stable on soft ground and also make it quickly disassemblable and reassembled without losing alignment? Silver sockets that fit like puzzles into grooves on the wood are a simple engineering answer, elegant and practical. Consider the menorah described as beaten of one piece. The difference between a candlestick cast in parts and a one-piece object beaten from a single sheet is not merely wordplay. It implies a metallurgical culture comfortable with repeated heating and cooling, with control of work hardening, with knowledge of the ductility and malleability of precious metals. It implies workshops, portable or stable, equipped with tools and processes that produce consistent results. The presence of a breastplate set with 12 gems, each engraved and arranged with symbolic significance, suggests not just artisanry, but also maintains supply lines or trade connections that could supply precious stones and colored materials. The purple and scarlet textiles, if derived from marine mollusks, point beyond a desert economy to coastal extraction and possibly to networks of exchange. All of this is to say, the biblical account, read carefully, describes a sanctuary that is both portable and technically demanding. That tension, mobility plus high craftsmanship, is at the heart of why an object found in a remote mountainous crevice could be so discomforting to conventional narratives.
Archaeology has often assumed a link between sedentary complexity and technological sophistication. Settled states accumulate surplus, craft specialization, and infrastructure. Nomads are thought to be materially austere. If mobile groups could produce work of the precision we find described in Exodus, then our categories need adjustment. Back at Ararat, indefinito, pending dendrochronology and a secure stratigraphic context. The metal edge bore signs of hammering and annealing, a pattern of microcracking and grain flow that to experienced metallurgists resembled worked gold and silver alloys rather than poured bronze. Textile fibers stained with a purple compound yielded molecular traces in spectroscopy suggestive of brominated indigoids, the class chemically associated with molluscan purple, but the signal was weak, complicated by long-term hydrolysis and contamination. Each tentative result carried a label, suggestive evidence, hypothesis, indefinito. Those labels mattered. They prevented headlines that would announce tabernacle found on Ararat and forced a slower, more interdisciplinary conversation. How often do we place an object within a cultural horizon based on just a surface match? The team reframed their questions. Not does this prove Exodus, but what does this object, if it indeed dates to the 2nd millennium BCE, tell us about the distribution of craft knowledge, portable shrine technology, and ritual material culture across the ancient Near East? The move from sensational claim to careful question is the work of proper scholarship, and it also yields a richer story. So let us imagine, in controlled separate scenarios, what the Ararat object could mean, each clearly labeled for its degree of certainty. Hypothesis A, conservative. The object is a composite of multiple episodes. It may have been assembled centuries later from older components, or it may represent a regional style that borrowed techniques from settled workshops. In this view, the object's similarities to descriptions in Exodus are the product of shared technological repertoires across cultures. Beating gold into ornamental shapes, modular silver footings, and rich dyed textiles were not unique to a single group. They circulated. This scenario requires careful dating. Radiocarbon for the wood, thermoluminescence where applicable for any fired fragments, isotopic and compositional studies for metals. If the dates cluster tightly in a period far later than the Exodus layer, the find still matters because it forces us to refine narratives about craft transmission and ritual mobility. Hypothesis B, provocative. The object dates to a time frame comparable to early 2nd millennium contexts, and its construction techniques align closely with the specialized instructions for the tabernacle. If so, it suggests that highly skilled mobile sanctuaries existed and moved with their communities, supported by trained artisans who could travel and reassemble complex sacred furniture. This would challenge models that strictly separate nomadic life from sustained craft specialization. It would not by itself prove narrative details of Scripture, but it would render the biblical description plausibly within the technological reach of the period. Hypothesis C, speculative. If the object can be shown by multiple independent analyses to share materials and workmanship almost identical to what textual descriptions would predict, if goldwork, acacia joinery, and mollusk-dyed textiles all fall into a close chronological bracket, then the find becomes a conversation starter about a living tradition remembered in the biblical narrative. Even then, the relationship between a single artifact and a text that was shaped over centuries is complex. Text and artifact may converge because both descend from shared practices, or because later authors retrojected familiar features into narrative memory. The word to repeat in this scenario is humility. Even a powerful match does not reduce interpretive work, it enlarges it. Across these models, there is a recurring technical question. Could a desert people realistically manipulate metals to the degree Exodus implies? The short, tempered answer is yes, but not magically. To beat large forms from gold, artisans must alternate heating to soften metal, annealing, with hammering to shape it. Gold's high ductility helps. It does not require temperatures above 1064 degrees Celsius unless it is to be melted. To shape rather than melt, the critical technologies are bellows, controlled fuel, and knowledge of work hardening cycles.
Acacia charcoal, dense and with a high calorific value, can produce high temperatures in a well-built furnace. Archaeological experiments have shown that with bellows and small footprint furnaces, pre-industrial smiths could reach and maintain temperatures sufficient for copper and bronze work, and, given suitable fuel and practice, could conduct complex goldsmithing tasks. In other words, the technical capability is feasible if a community invests skill and time into craft specialization. The social investment needed for such craft is as important as the physics. The Zal and Aholiab function as the narrative's answer to that social problem. The text frames them as instructors and supervisors. They are not lone geniuses, but coordinators of a learning network. The same dynamic is visible in many pre-industrial crafts. Enslaved or marginalized groups, when given access to tools and instruction, quickly become skilled artisans. The narrative's quiet social revolution, turning laborers into sacramental technicians, carries theological meaning and social practicality. If the people mobilized their labor to produce single, high-quality ritual items, they would have had to organize supply, apprenticeship, and quality control. They would also have had to develop portable infrastructure, collapsible forges, toolkits that could be stored in trunks, marking systems to reassemble parts in exact positions. That modular thinking offers a neat resolution to a perennial archaeological puzzle: how to move heavy wooden frames intact while preserving alignment and ritual function. A series of silver sockets, each stamped and numbered, fitting grooves in the timber, would be an elegant solution. The furniture could be slotted together like a carpenter's puzzle, tightened and then placed in the tent. When it was time to travel, the pieces would be separated and stored. This is not mere speculation. The functional problem demands an answer, and modular metal bases provide one. Returning to the Ararat cleft, the retrieval team reported finding a fragment that looked like such a socket, a concave metal piece with small wear marks corresponding to repeated insertion and removal. Its alloy showed a higher silver content than typical regional hoards, with trace elements that suggested a local source, manipulated with sophisticated refining techniques. Again, the initial results were indefinito in chronology and provenance. Even so, the pattern suggested a possibility. If mobile sanctuaries used standardized metal fittings, their material traces could survive far from their original geographic centers, carried by travelers, traded as prestige objects, or deposited intentionally in cryptic caches. We must also attend to the textiles. Dyeing purple for marine mollusks is labor-intensive. A handful of shells yields a tiny amount of dye, requiring the collection of large numbers of specimens and specialized processing, exposure to sunlight and salt in precise sequences. For a desert population to produce such textiles, they needed access to coastal trade or seasonal travel to extract the resource. That implies networks of exchange linking inland groups to coastal economies. The molecular signature detected in the Ararat textile sample, while weak, points to brominated indigoids, the class associated with Tyrian purple. If confirmed, it makes a powerful case for the interconnectedness of ancient communities across ecological zones. What seals the argumentative tension between text and artifact is the ritual function of those textiles. Embroidered curtains, sashes, and priests' vestments are not mere decoration. They are the interface between human bodies and a designated place of divine presence.
If the Ararat fabric fragment belongs to a vestment or curtain, and if its composition echoes colors reserved for sacred contexts in a textual tradition, then the object intersects spheres of technology, trade, and theologies of presence. All of these lines of analysis run into the same methodological wall: dating. Radiocarbon dating, metallurgical lead isotope ratios, and stratigraphic context must all point in the same direction to make a persuasive case. One anomalous technique, say a peculiar alloy, can be explained by local adaptation. Multiple lines converging strengthen the argument. The team at Ararat publicly framed their findings the way responsible scholars must. We have recovered material with suggestive characteristics. Multiple independent analyses are underway. Chronological context is indefinito. Interpretations remain provisional. That measured sentence kept the conversation open without collapsing into either triumphalism or cynicism. Beyond method, the discovery invited reflection about the way sacred technology shapes worship. The tabernacle narrative emphasizes that the structure and its furnishings were not merely symbols, but places and objects through which divine presence was mediated. The cloud of glory that settled upon the tent is the story's seal. If portable shrines with high craftsmanship existed, then the notion of a portable presence is not a theological fiction, but an embodied practice. A community could carry its sacred center with it, physically and ritually intact. That has profound implications for how we think about the relationship between God and space. Sacredness can be configured, encoded, and transported. The discovery also reopened a longue durée conversation. Why, given the capacity to craft such a portable shrine, did Israel later move toward a fixed temple in Jerusalem? The trajectory from a mobile tent to Solomon's temple is not a simple upgrade from rustic to refined. It is a shift in religious imagination. In a mobile configuration, the divine presence is with a community that marches. In a permanent temple, presence is localized and centralized. If the Ararat find suggests that portability and sophistication were compatible, it invites historians to reconsider the social and political motives behind centralization, issues like kingly authority, economic taxation, and the aesthetics of state power. The human stories threaded through the technical details are vital. The transformation of people who had been enslaved into elite artisans is perhaps the most moving part of the tabernacle narrative. Imagine the hand that once pressed bricks now steadying a chisel to carve acacia, or the woman who once wove coarse sacks now counting weft and warp to produce a priestly ephod embroidered with gold thread. Those human gestures, the learning, the mentorship, the passing on of craft secrets, illuminate a social history that an object alone cannot tell.
Objects bear traces of craftsmanship. People tell how those crafts were taught, resisted, and institutionalized. At Ararat, oral histories gathered from local communities added a social dimension that complemented laboratory results. Shepherds who had long grazed flocks on the mountain slopes told of old caches and of travelers who crossed the highlands carrying glinting things wrapped in cloth. A handful of such testimonies do not constitute evidence in the scientific sense, yet they contextualize why objects might be far from home: pilgrimage, trade, exile, or deliberate concealment. It is plausible that an object affiliated with a portable cultic tradition traveled widely and ended up in a crevice through a chain of human stories now lost to us. When scholars confronted their colleagues with a single provocative question, can the mobility and technical complexity coexist, the debate became animated but constructive. Some argued for a revision of periodization. Craft specialization need not be exclusive to urban polities. Others cautioned about overreading a single find. Many recommended an integrated approach, combined textual exegesis, experimental archaeology, recreating small-scale portable forges and modular furniture, and rigorous material science. Experimental archaeology has the power to reduce speculation. If a team can reproduce a one-piece beaten candlestick with tools reconstructible from late Bronze Age contexts, using acacia charcoal, bellows, and tooling that could be portable, then the technical plausibility becomes demonstrable. If dyeing experiments can show how a desert community might prepare purple on a trade-forged timeline, then the economic dimension becomes plausible. The Ararat find thus becomes a spur to creative scholarship. It compels us to test the practicable even as we read the ancient text. Theological reflection must follow method. For believers, the idea that God's presence could be carried with careful craft is theologically rich. It suggests that the divine does not require stone permanence. God can inhabit the care of human hands, the meticulous work of a bench, and the gifts given to artisans. Yet theology and archaeology speak different languages. The one interprets meaning, the other material traces. The productive place is where they meet in humility. The Ararat discovery invites religious readers to appreciate the material roots of faith practices, and invites scholars to recognize that texts encode memory in ways sometimes recoverable by artifacts. In the end, the most responsible conclusion about the cleft on Mount Ararat is both exciting and modest. The artifact's characteristics are suggestive: metalworking with evidence of beating and annealing, wood consistent with acacia species, traces of dye that might indicate molluscan origins. But chronology and context remain indefinitive in several critical aspects. This is not a failure. It is the normal rhythm of archaeology.
Initial excitement gives way to months or years of lab work, to peer review, to debates at conferences, and to the slow calibration of claims. What the Ararat episode does achieve immediately is to force historians and readers of Scripture to imagine differently. The story of the tabernacle, with its high craftsmanship and portability, ceases to be an oddity of religious literature and becomes a technical challenge that real hands could have answered. Whether or not archaeologists can ever point to a single object and say, without qualification, this verifies that narrative, the dialogue between text and material culture becomes richer.
The discovery functions as a mirror. It shows us the limits of our assumptions and the contours of plausible ancient realities. And so the implications are threefold. First, material culture can illuminate scripture. Artifacts and textiles can make tangible practices that texts presuppose. Second, scripture can frame archaeological interpretation. When a text records a sophisticated object, archaeologists can look for the technical fingerprints that such an object would carry. Third, both disciplines must practice epistemic humility. Neither single texts nor single finds can resolve complex histories without a web of corroborating evidence. A final reflection returns to the human scale. Whether the object in Ararat ultimately ends up dated to a period contemporary with textual memories or to a later reuse, it remains an artifact of human handiwork. Hammer marks on metal, the bend of a wooden tongue, a dyed thread. Those marks connect past and present through labor, ingenuity, and devotion. The artisans who once learned under masters like Bezalel did not simply make objects, they encoded patterns of meaning. They taught, argued, and improvised. They turned materials into places where people could meet the divine. If you want to follow where this conversation goes next, how those portable technologies may have evolved into Solomon's temple, and what that transition tells us about religion and politics, watch the video we made on how Solomon built the temple. Subscribe so you don't miss the follow-up. Share this with someone who loves history that asks hard questions of both stone and text. For now, the fissure on Mount Ararat keeps its secrets a little longer. The fragments recovered invite patient work, more dating, more isotopic mapping, and comparative studies with known artifacts from coastal workshops and desert camps. They also invite a posture of awe. Whether the object becomes a cornerstone of a revised archaeology of nomadic sanctuaries or remains an intriguing anomaly, it has already done something valuable. It has made us look again at how people, through skill, faith, and cooperation, crafted places for the holy.